Good morning. Welcome to today's program. It's called Hello, I'm Grieving. My name is Reverend Gail Morton, and I'm here today with my cohort, Reverend Cheryl Gass, to answer your questions on change, grief, and the labels that keep us from healing. The intention of today's class, which is the first of three, is to explore this idea that if we learn how to meet death well, it can grow us into stronger and more capable people. It's an entirely different way of understanding how death and loss impact our lives. In gathering our energy around this topic, I'll begin by praying us in with an invocation. Immersing in this sacred moment, this is what I know. There is only one. Call it love, peace, wisdom, joy, light, beauty. This intelligent divine energy is everywhere present, all powerful, and it is always giving of itself without any hesitation. And I know that I am, and each person here is, made in the image and likeness of this one. I am so grateful today for this time together, and I give thanks for the powerful light within each person here, and for knowing that this light is always present, growing and expanding as I move into our topic today. And so it is. Amen. So briefly, I'm a staff minister here at the center with a special focus on healing and healing practices through prayer, through ceremony, and through ritual. I'm also board certified in interfaith chaplaincy and pastoral care and spiritual counseling. And I've been a student of spiritual healing practices for more than 10 years. And I'm here with my cohort, Cheryl Gass, also a staff minister at the center. Cheryl, can you share your background and ministry with our audience and just say hello?
Sure, I'd be glad to. I'm a staff minister as well at the center. My path has been, I started at the center in 2007 and took my time going to practitioner training and everything else, but knowing that this was a journey that I really, really wanted to take. And one of the great joys of this journey is getting to know Gail and all the things that she has taught me about grief. I've taken her classes and her workshops, and I think it's just expanded my ability to help people that are grieving and are going through that period of loss. And it's just really brought me to a fuller place, because one of the things I realized as a practitioner and now as a minister is that everyone that has come to me so far is experiencing some sort of loss, and they're grieving. And I think that that's why I really love the ministry that Gail is putting forth. Mine is more about community outreach, and I would really like to, bring more people into this and see the beauty of this teaching. That's kind of my goal as my ministry. And I'm just so grateful that Gail asked me to be here today. And it's a wonderful experience. Anything that she does ends up being just absolutely beautiful. So I'm just going to turn it back over to you, Gail.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Reverend Cheryl. And as you can tell, Reverend Cheryl has a wealth of knowledge on this subject and a big, compassionate heart. And that will really provide a lot of depth to today's discussion. So friends, I'm excited to announce today a series of classes that explore what happens when we die. These classes offer a comprehensive map of both living and dying. And it's from the perspective of modern consciousness research. So as a CSL interfaith chaplain, I often serve as a kind of clergy for the unchurched, helping people find meaning in difficult situations. And the material in this class and the next two classes is at the core of how I support people in that way. So death and bereavement really call us into a new relationship with life. existential, spiritual, and relational issues become more important for all of us. And we face big questions about the nature of reality and our place in it. All of us look for meaning making, a meaning making framework that allows us to hold our past, our present, and our future in a healing way. So, as I support clients on their spiritual journey around death and loss, I use the teachings from this class to offer such a framework and to help answer some of their burning questions. And this is what some of them sound like. So, someone I love is dying. How can we continue to be connected after they leave their body? Will my deceased father be with me when I walk down the aisle on my wedding day? My grandfather said that he's afraid he'll go to hell for killing people while he was in the military. How do I help him? I made poor decisions in my life, and I'm ashamed to see my parents again after I die. Will they judge me? These are all actual questions that people ask as they're moving through this journey. And honestly, I can't tell people what will happen in these situations because I don't know. But I can offer them a perspective that helps them make peace with what's concerning them by sharing how I understand the soul's evolutionary journey. So the teachings of Hello, I'm Grieving will provide you with a coherent picture of the soul's journey in and out of the physical body. And these teachings will also help you understand death and loss in a whole new way and will give you tools to meet mortality with grace and with more confidence. So if you're thinking right now that this class may not be relevant for you as you're not currently grieving, I invite you to stick around because death of the physical body is universal and the evolution of the soul is both universal and eternal. So let's jump into today's program. So in my work with dying people and their families, I experience over and over and over again how difficult death and dying are. And a big part of this challenge is that in our Western culture, we don't really understand death. And because we don't understand it, we don't know how to meet it. And so it ends up being much harder for us than it needs to be. Death is hard and it's sad. That's normal. But it doesn't have to be frightening. It doesn't have to be overwhelming and confusing. Death is really hard in our Western culture because we don't have a full picture of what's happening. The Western approach essentially excludes the spiritual and the energetic dynamic of the process and really only addresses the parts we can measure and see. When we recognize death as an energetic process, a spiritual process, a soul process, we can start to apply practical and effective healing interventions that work at the soul level. So as we begin today, I encourage you, post your questions. Cheryl and I will do our very best to answer your questions today. And if we're not able to answer your questions today, or questions arise, maybe as you reflect on what you learned today, rest assured over the next 3 classes, they'll be answered. Hello, I'm Grieving is going to expand on this first topic today and answer your questions as this program is, again, the first in a series on soul-focused care for each of us on our soul journey. So as we explore what's happening spiritually and energetically, I hope this program series is of value for you, value for your family, and for all of those that you support. And because we're not in the same place, and we can't have that full physical body language sense of each other, which we do in some of our former experiences with Beyond Grief and Grief Works, I'm going to introduce a few hand signals that can amplify that body language. And it's really a way to deepen. So much of our healing is about deepening threads of connection. And that's why we're here, that deep connection. So the first signal is this. And it was introduced to me as American Sign Language. There you go, Cheryl. And it's sign language for clapping. And it means, oh, wow, what you just said really resonates with me. So it's an affirmation. And it gives everyone a little twinkle. So there we go. Try it. Just give it a little twinkle. See how it feels. Yeah, it's fun to do it. It's just plain fun. So that's a twinkle. And anytime something is said that resonates with you, you're welcome to twinkle. And the other thing is there's a lot of tenderness in this room. There's a lot of tenderness, lots of grief, lots of love, and there's lots of beauty and grace here too. So if you hear something that really touches you, put your hand on your heart. And you might have to do it high up so we can see it on the screen, but that says to the person speaking, I'm with you. I'm really with you at a heart level. So these are the tools that we can use today to deepen this field that we're in together. So I'm going to start out now today's program by defining grief in simple terms so we can all start out on the same page. And then Cheryl and I are going to move into discussing common questions asked by grievers while you formulate your own. Although no two scenarios, no two losses, and no two grief experiences are ever the same, we trust that you'll benefit from what we've learned and what we're sharing from others. In first discussing today common questions asked by grievers, which is our first step, we're going to clear the air and build a fundamental framework through which we will then be more intimately able to examine the soul's journey, which is what we'll do in class 2 and 3. So what is grief in simple terms? Well, grief is the normal and natural response or reaction to loss of any change from what is familiar in life. It's an emotional response, the emotional response to change. And it can be defined as a feeling, and I emphasize feeling associated with the things we wish had been different, better, or more in any relationship. And whether the loss is of a person, or maybe it's a job, or it's a pet, maybe it's an educational experience, maybe it's even a place of residence, it doesn't matter. Grief can be a result of unmet hopes, dreams, and expectations in any relationship as well. So you might notice in my definition of grief, I included the definition of other significant losses, not just death and dying. And although the focus today of Hello, I'm Grieving is around the loss experienced around death and dying, we grieve around any and all significant losses in our lives. And the insight that you'll glean today from this program can be applied to any type of loss. So I'm looking at my cohort, Cheryl, and wondering what her thoughts are on grief and mourning.
Well, what I would like to know if you defined grief, but what is mourning? If it's different from grief, then how do you explain the difference, or what is the difference?
Cheryl, thank you so much for that question. It's a great question. So mourning is simply the public expression of grief. Mourning's how we outwardly express our inward feelings of grief. Some actually call mourning grief gone public. That gives you a good visual. And the reason that mourning is important is that we cannot move through our grief experience without mourning. So we have grief, all these experiences deep inside, and then we need to express those. And that is the most important component of healing through grief. And actually, mourning, I'm happy to tell you, goes way beyond tears and anger, even though tears and anger are a part of mourning. Mourning is really any and all outward expressions of grief, whether these expressions hurt within the body or not. So finding a way to honor your loved one, or finding a way to honor your intangible loss, if it's something like a job loss or a loss of faith, can actually not hurt, but feel good. And yet it's still an outward expression of grief or mourning. So let me give you some examples. So sharing stories about your loved one is mourning. Keeping one of your loved one's traditions alive is mourning. Establishing a new tradition to honor your loved one is mourning. Grief and mourning are unique to each person. And what do we know unique means? It means one of a kind. So we're each going to grieve and mourn differently. So
So
Cheryl, any thoughts on that?
yeah, I was just going to say that I think that that's one of the things that people run across, that they feel as though, especially with the Kubler-Ross, set of, these are the 5 stages. Most people aren't aware of the fact that that's the 5 stages of accepting death, not so much what you do after, what the person afterwards did, but it's been brought into this field of thinking you're going to feel anger, you're going to bargain, you're going to come to a place where you accept, and you're going to be sad and you're going to be depressed, whatever. But what if it's unique to each person? I can see where people would feel, I shouldn't be feeling this way because this isn't what you're supposed to feel when you're grieving. And so how does it typically manifest? Recognizing that it's not going to be the same for everyone, but some of the typical things that you see.
Okay. That's, again, a really great question, because Reverend Cheryl is exactly right. Grief is unique to every person, and it's going to manifest differently for each person, and that is normal and natural for them. And that's a wonderful thing for us all to remember when we're going through grief ourselves, but also when we're supporting someone going through grief, because that's the most common concern is what I'm experiencing normal or natural? So grief can manifest in a variety of ways, and I could never name all of them. We could be here for days and I couldn't name all of them because, again, it's unique to each person. But let me give you some examples just so you have some ideas of how sometimes grief might manifest. So some people find that the confusing feelings that grief generates interferes with their sleep. And others find it challenging to get up and function after waking up. They just want to sleep all day. Both are really common responses to grief. Many find themselves longing for that relationship that's lost. And others find, especially when they discover that their friends seem to be able to offer little meaningful help, and that does happen sometimes, that they lose some of their ability to trust in others. That's a very common thing that happens. And some people find themselves really easily irritated, and others find they don't have the energy to do much of anything. So for some, the memories leading up to, including the moment of loss, tend to overshadow all of their fond memories of the relationship. So I think you're getting the picture that, simply stated, grief can be overwhelming. And just as overwhelming can be the labels that are put on grievers and the advice that they're given. Mm-hmm. So with that basic background, let's move into our first question, Cheryl.
Okay, no problem. It's been years. This is just the question. It's been years since my loved one died. And why don't I feel better? Why am I not over this? So
I think that's one of the most common questions that we get when we're working with grievers. And the answer is there are layers of possible answers here. So unlike a physical injury, there truly is no anticipated or typical rate of healing for grief. The time that it takes for one person is going to be very different from another. I always like to say grief takes the time that it takes. And the time element has to be accompanied by the correct action steps. And that's because healing from grief is never passive. It's actually active. You've got to be an active participant in your healing journey. So I mentioned layers. Here's some of the layers that you might think about. So a really common misconception is that grief should last about a year, right? And then, hey, it's been a year, need to move on. And the truth is there's no magic to 1 year of grief, no magic at all. Healing takes place in small increments. And if you're grieving and you feel like, gosh, nothing seems to be advancing, I don't feel like I'm healing, it might be helpful to ask yourself this question. When you look at your life post-loss, are there times when you are feeling a little better? Are there moments when you laugh? Are there times, even if they're brief, when you're able to focus on something other than the loss? When you look back at these smaller moments over time, what most people notice is that they're growing, and that means you're making progress. So that's the first layer. The second is that grief is often very complex, and there's many layers to work through. So what I mean by that is that your most recent grief may be very well connected to a past loss. That's true for most of us. And you may not realize that you're actually attempting to process more than one loss at the same time. So if you think about most of us that are here today probably have had 15, maybe 18 very significant emotional losses in their lifetime. That's a lot of losses. And many of us have not healed through all of those losses. So I think it's helpful to realize that you may be trying to process more than the healing of more than one loss. And it also helps to practice self-compassion with yourself. A lot of times we become critical with ourselves if we don't feel like we've healed or that we're healing. And your progress actually hurts that healing process more than you realize. Well, how do you process through old losses? Well, a great way to do it is we have an 8-week course that we offer at the center called Beyond Grief. And that's one of the things that we do there. We discover what old losses haven't been healed, and we help you complete them so that you can complete your healing process. So a third layer that's really important to notice is that you may not have taken the right action steps. And without taking the right action steps, you can prolong your grief. It can actually take a lot longer than it needs to. So if you've been struggling with grief for a long time and you're not seeing small steps of progress, you likely haven't healed through your grief. Consider working with a grief counselor if that's the case, one-on-one, or attending our Centers Beyond Grief 8-week recovery workshop. You'll be glad that you did. Grief recovery is always about taking, there we go, the right action steps. And if you don't know what those steps are, and most of us don't, it's not natural to know these steps. It's difficult to implement them, right? So there is a process, that Beyond Grief course, to help you through that. So Cheryl, I just described several different layers that might complicate the healing process through grief. What would you like to add from your experience working with grievers?
Well, one of the things that really struck me was that, if you don't heal from old grief, and maybe you're not even aware of it, but it's that thing that if you're going through some similar situation, whether it be a relationship or something like that, I'll just use a relationship as an example, that you realize that there's another loss here, and maybe a previous relationship just, you never really incorporated that thought into your thinking. In other words, you just kind of wrote it out, but didn't do, like Gail said, take the steps to really know that you're over it and you've gotten through it. And the way you can tell is every time it comes up, it triggers something in you. So you put a button on yourself here, to push whenever something like that happens. But I read this thing recently from Elizabeth Gilbert. She wrote on grief. It was a great article. If you get an opportunity, go online and read it. It's really great. It says, grief happens upon you. It's bigger than you. There is a humility that you have to step into where you surrender to being moved through the landscape of grief by grief itself. And it has its own timeline, its own time frame. It has its own itinerary with you. It has its own power over you, and it will come when it comes. So when I read that, it reminded me of what you said, that if I haven't processed something that's happened before, I'm just going to make it twice as bad when this happens now, because I have these unresolved issues around the past grief. And so I think that's really, really important to understand that there is no time frame. There is no, all of a sudden you'll be ready to go somewhere and grief will take you to your knees. You don't know why. All of a sudden it just hits you. But that's okay. It's supposed to do that. You've got to process and walk through it.
Beautiful. Thank you, Cheryl, for sharing that. And that grief will get your attention no matter what. There's nothing you can do to avoid it. And as Cheryl said in that quote, what we recommend is that you lean into it. that you lean into it lightly, not heavily. You lean into it lightly, allow it to flow, and then move forward. And we have some suggestions in our grief groups that help you with that leaning into process. So most people, many people, but not all, experience a deep fog, a big shock when there is a big loss of any kind, be it a death or otherwise. So Cheryl, I wonder if you want to jump into that next question, because this is such a common experience. I think it'd be helpful for us to talk about it.
Okay, no problem. This is the next question. It said, since my husband died a few weeks ago, I find myself doing things I never used to do, like losing my keys, and I even have found myself talking to his picture. Am I going crazy?
It's a great question, because it's so commonly experienced. And it's probably the most common question that I get from grievers is, this is happening, am I okay? And is what I'm feeling normal? And rest assured, your experience of grief is completely normal. You're not going crazy. A lot of times it feels like it. You're not going crazy, you're grieving. The two are very, very different. And each of us, as I said, is affected by grief in our own way. But our soul has a wonderful, wonderful way of protecting us from the overwhelm of a significant loss. It's common to feel numb, to feel absent-minded, like in our question, losing my keys, and even in a complete fog after experiencing a significant loss. And that is our soul's beautiful way of supporting us in integrating our loss in small doses so that your heart can manage. In most cases, these thoughts and actions you find unique and strange are only temporary. They may last for a few days, a few weeks, or maybe a few short months. But these feelings gradually start to fade. They start to fade. They just don't go away. They start to fade and disappear as you continue your journey through the grief and mourning process. So in the early stages of grief, which is when this is most common, you might consider consulting a grief counselor or seeking help from a support group like GriefWorks here at the center on Tuesdays at 5 p.m. This action step that we've been talking about can help you to normalize all that you're experiencing. So Cheryl, any thoughts on that, or do you want to jump into our next question?
I think I'd just like to jump into our next question, if that's okay. It says, does everyone who is grieving go through the same stages of grief? And I think that goes back to us saying the 5 stages of grief, that's not really applies to the grief that you feel. It applies before you die, what people go through when they know they're going to experience a transition. And so a friend at work asked if I was in the anger stage of grief because my son died at such a young age. Am I doing something wrong because I have not felt anger about his death? So I think that goes back to how we react, and we have this programmed idea that this is how it's supposed to unfold. But if you're going to go through the 5 stages, you could go through all 5 of them in one day. So it's not like a process or a step. So what do you think? What are your thoughts on that, Gail?
So I love this question because it always comes up. There was some beautiful work done by a woman by the name of Elizabeth Kubler-Ross. Mm-hmm. And she is the one that defined these stages of grief. And most people have heard of them. So they think, okay, I'm waiting for this to happen. How come it's not happening? Mm-hmm. Well, contrary to popular belief, as Cheryl stated, these stages of grief, they start with denial, then go through anger, bargaining, depression, and acceptance. Mm-hmm. They were established by a lot of research that Elizabeth Kubler-Ross did, but it's upon a really narrow application, as Cheryl said. Her research was done, and there was a lot of it done, and it's very valid for this narrow application. And her results were solely based on a very narrow population, stages of grief individuals go through once they have received a terminal diagnosis. And the stages do not go beyond this research group. So there's really no predictable stages that you go through beyond what happens to you. There's no predictable stages. And most of us, quite frankly, experience grief like a roller coaster. There's ups and there's downs, there's good days and bad days, there's curves, some are tighter than others. There's no universal stages of grief. Each of us has our own personal pathway as we experience loss. And there's also no timetable to grief, as we spoke before. Yet you'll likely find that with the right action steps and leaning into those feelings of grief and the expression of mourning, that as time passes and with the right actions, the pain is going to lessen. I like to call it soften. The pain softens. And you start to return to earlier levels of functioning, both in your personal and your professional life. Cheryl, any thoughts on our next question?
I just have a thought on the question that we just answered also.
Perfect.
That we have to remember that everything in our life is energy, and grief is a force of energy, and it can't be controlled or predicted. That goes back to what Gail just said. So when you set up expectations that this is how I'm supposed to be feeling now, or I've been through this now for a year, I should be feeling this, or I should be doing this, you got to quit shoulda on yourself. You just got to roll with it. And like Gail said, I love that phrase, lean into it gently. Just lean into it. It doesn't mean you have to stay in that position. You can just walk through it. Just gently, slowly walking through it. That's the way I just see it all unfolding. From, when I've gone through experiences of grief, I fought it and resisted it and thinking I shouldn't be feeling this way. You've just got to quit beating yourself up about what you're feeling. You've got to just experience it. And that's how it, to me, that's the perfect way to experience grief. So I'm going to go on with the next question. Does everyone who is grieving go through the same? I'm sorry. That's the other one. I'm sorry. I got off a minute there. My father died a few months ago, and I'm still feeling sad. My siblings have joined a bereavement support group and want me to go, but I'm just not one of those people who liked talking to others about my feelings. What can I do on my own?
So I love this question because I've already shared that we have a couple of grief opportunities at the center, that our groups, also one-on-one with our practitioners and our ministers, are always options. But that doesn't work for everybody. Some people really work best on their own. So the question is a really good reminder for me that there's no one right way to go through grief and mourning. And what works for one person isn't necessarily going to work for another, right? Even in the same family, which is our question scenario. So some people find support in reading books, reading poetry to help them understand and work through grief. Understand some of the things that we're talking about today. Journaling, I would suggest, is another great tool that is more private than attending a group, because you never have to share what you've written with anyone else, just your own soul. And another benefit of journaling is that it can be a way to gain valuable information about ourselves and offer you some new insights. It helps us to gain clarity as you move through the grief journey. And that being said, those are just 3 suggestions. Whatever steps you choose to take, maybe it's artwork, maybe it's through music, there's so many different ways. Just make sure that you're approaching your feelings of grief honestly, because it's not possible to heal anything that we're not honest about. And that's true for anything in our lives. So Cheryl, what other thoughts do you have on how do we grieve on our own?
Well, for grieving on your own, like Gail said at the beginning, at times, if you're still stuck in a place or you feel like you're stuck and that you just don't see any steps moving forward, it might be helpful to have a one-on-one conversation with someone. A grief counselor is great, but maybe it's a really dear friend that really understands you and can take the time to listen to you. Somebody that will listen to what you're feeling and not invalidate what you're feeling. Just know that this is absolutely normal. But the other thing is to just realize that it is a very personal journey. And please don't allow other people to tell you how you're supposed to be feeling. and then have that feeling that maybe it is a sibling. Why don't you get over this? Why are you still so sad about this? Maybe they process grief differently. Fine, that's terrific, that's wonderful, but don't feel that you have to follow a certain pattern or you have to listen to what other people are saying. Now, if somebody's coming to you and it's been 4 years since the death or since the loss, and you're still right in the very throes of this, then they might be giving you some clue that you need to do something else. You need to do something to help you walk through this. One of the things that I love, and I've said this so many times, but it was Dr. Tom Costa said, "Yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I don't have to stop and build a condo here." In other words, I don't have to live in this space. I can move forward without betraying this person or betraying the love that we had or betraying the feelings that we felt for each other at all. I mean, it's time for you to go forward and express and be the beautiful manifestation of spirit that you are. That's what your job is to continue to live the life that you were put here, this precious, beautiful life that you've been given, to go ahead and live it and enjoy it. What do you think, Gail?
Well, I love that expansion on that answer, Cheryl. Really, really valuable stuff. And I'll just add one more thing before we go on to the next question is, one of the reasons why people sometimes struggle or resist grieving and mourning is that they feel somehow that by doing that process and by having good days as well as more difficult days, that does this mean that I'm forgetting about my loved one? And what I want to assure you is that we can never, ever, ever forget about the person who died. We can't. We can't forget because they're a part of us. They're always going to be a part of us. And we're going to continue that bond forever. It always lasts. Yes, we live forward with them, but it is in a different and in a new way because our lives are different and our lives are new. So sometimes we're afraid that if we let go of grief, we'll let go of that connection. But death can never end our relationship. We always stay connected. It's just in a different way.
Perfect.
So Cheryl, we had a really good question about should I be grieving more? Let's jump into that one.
Okay, let's see. My husband died after a long struggle with ALS, and while I'm sad that he's gone, I also feel some relief that he's no longer dealing with the impact of that illness, and that I can now focus more time and energy on being with my grandchildren. I miss him, but I worry sometimes, should I be grieving more? Should you?
And that's a great question. And that question is all about one thing, which is called conflicting feelings. And that's really common when you've had a significant loss. We're going to have conflicting feelings. Sometimes the feelings are relief as well as sadness. That's very, very common for lots of reasons. So one common definition of grief actually uses conflicting feelings. It says something like this: grief are the conflicting feelings we experience when we encounter a significant emotional loss and all that previously seemed normal has now ended or changed in a significant way. And that goes for any type of loss. So conflicting feelings around significant loss is very common. And understanding this, we don't have to worry if we're doing better than we think we should be. As Cheryl said, get the shoulds out of the way, right? We can actually be comforted by it. We can be comforted by those feelings. So many grieving people find great comfort in having had the opportunity to say goodbye to the person who transitioned, or to realize that there's nothing they could have done to prevent their loss. Their loved one has moved forward in their own journey, just as they needed to. So grievers who have a good social support system or a strong sense of spirituality often face grief with a little more resilience. And studies actually show that conflicting feelings that we just are describing here are very, very common, normal, and natural. So Cheryl, I think we probably, yeah, can you
I
jump
want
in on
to add
that?
one thing onto that is
Uh,
one significant thing, especially when you have someone that's transitioned after a long illness or a long period of time and you've been a caregiver,
mm,
that that is the most difficult, most difficult time in your life probably is taking care of someone else's needs 24/7. And I've run into several people that have. And then when this person transitions, you have this feeling of relief. It's like this huge burden's been taken off of you. And then you immediately go to this place of, oh my gosh, I shouldn't feel this way. I should not feel relief. I should not feel like that, like I've been lightened, the load's been lightened. But caregiving, a lot of times, and they found this in so many studies, people that are caregivers often, if it's an extremely long illness, have develop illnesses themselves from the stress, or actually sometimes the caregiver actually ends up passing or transitioning before the person that they've been taking care of, because it is an extremely difficult job. So if you did feel relief or you felt some sort of feeling like that, that is totally normal. Totally normal. Don't beat yourself up about that either. There's another one. It's okay to feel what you're feeling at the time. Just roll with it. Anyway, go right ahead, Gail.
you always remember that experiencing life fully means feeling fully.
Mm-hmm.
There's no way around that, and that really is a very beautiful thing.
Yeah.
So Cheryl, I think probably our last question that we'll have time for today is more specific to going back to work. But the reason that we chose this question is that it really has to do with getting back into activities, the activities of your life, whether they are similar or different. So Cheryl, why don't you jump into that question and we'll talk about that.
Okay. While I'm still grieving the death of my son, it will be necessary for me to go back to work soon. How can I find ways to cope with my grief while also fulfilling my duties at my job?
So that could be duties at your job. It could be duties where you volunteer, duties at your church. It can be duties in your own place of residence. Okay. Sometimes it's very hard to pick up those things and get back into them. So let's give you some ideas. So I think my overall answer to this question is be gentle with yourself. Whenever you experience a rough day, recognize that you may not be able to accomplish everything that you set out to accomplish or that you desire to do. And that's okay. And if you're comfortable with it, consider sharing your grief with those who offer support. As Cheryl said, sometimes just a good friend, someone who's willing to listen, to understand, not to try to fix or give advice, because there's nothing to be fixed. But maybe have a conversation with someone who can offer some support. You'll find that many people don't know what to say, don't know what to do in a significant loss. And that's because of our Western culture, right?
Mm-hmm.
But utilize any resources that you have in place, be it within your center, our ministers, our practitioners, our grief groups. If you're going back to work, maybe Human Resources has a program, maybe some type of employee assistance program that they might offer support, counseling. And remember that grief is hard work. As Cheryl said, grief and mourning are energy. And so energy is a lot of hard work. So consider what's ever helped you in the past with a loss to cope. And remember that grief support, either individually or small groups, is always an option. Cheryl, what can you add to this before we jump into our summary and close?
Well, it's just, I just really love the thought of being gentle and compassionate with yourself. And if and sometimes just remember, if it wasn't a relationship where you had a positive interaction or something like that, that a lot of times what you feel, and I felt this, was that you always feel like something was left undone. Well, nothing was. Everything was completed and everything is just right, just the way it is right now. There's nothing, if you're sitting there regretting things that happened in the past or anything like that as part of this grieving process, you're having an argument you're never going to win. It is what it is, and then just move forward. and just keep moving forward, one little tiny baby step at a time. But you've got to stop just thinking that I could, like Gail said so perfectly, could have done something different. I might have changed this. I might have done that. But those are just arguments that you can't win. So sometimes you just got to say, okay, that's just the way it turned out, and this is the way it is. And
And,
so, Gail, you want to
and
finish this? You want anything else to say?
yeah, I'm just going to jump in and say, and remember in all of these scenarios that in any relationship, whether someone transitions suddenly or over a lengthy time period, we always have unfinished business. We have expectations for that relationship. We have dreams for that relationship. We have potentially undelivered communications, either things that we thought we said, but we weren't sure were heard, or maybe should have been said again, or maybe weren't said at all. And if you're feeling that you have some of these unresolved communications that are of an emotional nature, please contact me, Cheryl, other ministers at our center, or practitioners, because there are some processes that we can go through with you to help you communicate and therefore complete those otherwise unresolved and uncommunicated emotional needs. So you're not stuck if you have what a lot of people term as a regret. Please let us know, because we have processes that we can work with you to help you move through that experience. So we're drawing close to the end of our time together today. And I want to create a picture around what the next two programs are going to look like. So I want to kind of share that our program today was designed to answer the burning questions that Cheryl and I find are common to most grievers. And we thought that answering these questions today would clear some space and thereby support us as we move forward into Class 2 and Class 3, understanding the trajectory of the soul's journey. So we're really moving into the soul's journey. To support the dying and the bereaved, it's important to understand the fullness of that transformational journey on this side of the veil and the other. And an understanding of the soul dynamics of the end of life makes deep healing more possible. That's why we're heading there for everybody that's involved. So if you don't have a clear map of what's happening, it's hard to find a healing path through the experience, right? So please join us in our next program, which is going to provide a comprehensive map of the spiritual and the energetic dynamics of death and dying as they impact everybody involved in the process. And I think by understanding these subtle aspects of the soul's journey, it's going to allow you to see the otherwise hidden dimensions of this process. And when you know what's happening, you can cooperate with it. You can lean into it to help you facilitate healing. So the material in our next two programs is really at the core of how I support people that I work with. It helps them to understand death and loss in a whole new way and to give them tools to help meet mortality, theirs or others, with more grace and more confidence. So my hope is that it will do the same for you and your loved ones and anyone else that you support. So thanks for joining us today. Before I turn this conversation over to Reverend Cheryl, who's going to close us out, I want to invite each one of you to type in the chat, and that's at the very bottom of your Zoom screen, one word, one thing that you're taking away from this session, and then maybe one old belief or expectation that you're leaving behind. So if you're comfortable, we invite you to do that, and then Cheryl will close us out. We are so grateful that you're here today.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. It's just a brief announcement that, every day at 10 o'clock, and I think some of you are there is something at the center that's live, usually. Sometimes they're recorded, like mine was, but anyway. But just please take advantage of getting some spiritual food. That really, really helps a lot when you have a way of defining what you're feeling and understanding who and what you are. We are spiritual beings, and we are going to experience whatever human occurs to us, whatever is human in us is experiencing this, but there's no separation. It's still, we're still the spiritual beings having a human expression.
Mhm.
So don't hesitate to reach out and do, get some help if you need it. Really, it's very, very important. And it helps, it's just an enrichment of your life, just to make a fuller and happier life while walking through this kind of situation. And so please don't forget to click the button at the bottom of the screen here, and it's the donate button, because that's what keeps us the ability for us to continue this great programming and this great information that we're putting out there, not only to you, but to others at our center as well. And so I always like to say, when you go to a restaurant and you get food, you pay for it. And so if you're getting spiritually fed here, please don't forget to leave us a tip, in other words. Do something for the center. It would be fabulous. And so I'm just going to go into a brief benediction and we're going to close out. And so please just get comfortable in wherever you are, and let's just take a really deep breath and let it go. And I just know, and I recognize in this moment that this is a sacred space. This is a place where all of these feelings and emotions are now examined and brought forth, and recognizing that this is absolutely the natural state that we are in at this moment, that we are not crazy. We are absolutely perfect right now, just the way we are. And everything that we're walking through is just exactly where we need to be at this moment. And I know that I am eternally connected to the energy that's within this room right now. Every person present is this life force ready to burst forth and be the total beautiful expressions of God that we are. That you are now ready to live life to the fullest and completely. And I am so grateful for all of the nuggets and all of the beautiful wisdom that has come forth today. All the things that are now making it easier for us to walk through this experience. And I'm so grateful to Reverend Gail for all the work and the effort and the time that she has spent coming into this ministry, this perfectness of understanding what people are feeling and what they're experiencing. And so now I'm just going to let this go, and I release it to the universal energy, to the law, and I know that it is already manifesting within each and every life here. And so it is. Amen.
And so it is. Thank you for joining us.
Bye.